Welcome back. Take a deep breath, relax, and let the soothing whispers of this story guide you into a world of calm and mystery. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Arrival. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow across the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. A breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees that lined the cobblestone streets, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh earth and blooming lavender. It was the kind of evening where time seemed to stand still, where nothing could possibly go wrong. Miss Jane Marple, as she always did on a late afternoon, sat in her cosy sitting room, her favourite armchair cradling her as she sipped her tea, the warmth of the cup spreading through her fingers. Her knitting sat untouched on the side table, her mind wandering as it always did when the world was so still. The ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece was the only sound in the room, its steady rhythm a gentle reassurance. But then, just as she was about to settle into the peaceful quiet of the evening, there came a soft knock at the door. She straightened slightly in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing. Who could that be at this hour? Perhaps one of the villagers with a minor issue, or something more. With a soft sigh, Miss Marple rose, her slippers making no sound on the wooden floor. She opened the door to find no one. Yet, on the doorstep she found an envelope. It was peculiar, the paper a thick, creamy texture that seemed to glimmer ever so faintly in the light of the setting sun. The seal was a deep red, pressed with a symbol she did not recognize. A clock, its hands frozen at midnight. Her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple stepped back into the house, closing the door softly behind her. She turned the envelope over in her hands, studying it for a moment. No return address, no name, just the strange symbol. Who would send me such a thing? And why, at this hour? She sat down again in her armchair, the fire now crackling softly in the hearth, and gently broke the seal. The letter inside was short but cryptic. Dear Miss Marple, a great mystery is hidden within the midnight clock. Find the code, and you will unravel the truth. Beware, for the silence of the clock is deafening, and time is running out. Miss Marple's fingers trembled just slightly as she read the words again. A mystery, hidden within a clock. The midnight clock. She had never heard of such a thing. But it sounded important, vital even. Her mind began to whir, turning the phrase, the silence of the clock, over and over. The clock, frozen at midnight. Was it merely a timepiece, or something far more significant? Mystery, silence, a frozen time. This was no ordinary message. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. The room was quiet again, save for the soft crackle of the fire. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily on, unaware of the puzzle that had just been set in motion. But Miss Marple wasn't one to let such things lie. She was patient, yes, but always observant. This was no ordinary coincidence. The symbol on the letter, the peculiar wording. Something was happening, and I will uncover it. Her sharp eyes flickered to the window, where the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village. The mystery of the midnight clock had begun. The air seemed to grow heavier, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for Miss Marple to take the first step. As she placed her teacup gently back on the table, she knew that the peaceful, simple life she had always led was about to be shaken, if only ever so slightly. And with that thought she reached for her coat, ready to step out into the gathering dusk. Mystery, after all, always comes when least expected. But I am ready. Chapter 2. The Midnight Clock. The village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its usual rhythm by the next morning. The streets were quiet, save for the soft footsteps of villagers going about their daily routines, the hum of life unfolding like a well-worn path. Yet, for Miss Marple, the previous night's mystery clung to the air, like a whisper she couldn't quite catch. The letter had left an indelible mark on her thoughts, and as the sun rose and warmed the earth, she knew the next step was at hand. After a light breakfast of toast and jam, Miss Marple gathered her things, a notepad, a pen, and of course her sharp mind, and set off down the cobblestone streets. Today she was heading to a rather unremarkable place. The small antique shop at the far end of the village, the one that had a curious habit of acquiring peculiar objects, old books, weathered paintings, and sometimes even stranger things. As she walked, the morning mist still clung to the ground, casting a soft glow over the village. Birds chirped cheerfully from the branches of the trees, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far away, focused solely on the strange clock that had appeared in her life. The shop bell rang gently as she entered, and the musty scent of old wood and dust enveloped her. The shopkeeper, Mr. Merton, an elderly man with glasses perched low on his nose, looked up from his work, a faint smile crossing his lips as he saw Miss Marple. He was a kind soul, always ready with a story or two about the various oddities that passed through his hands. "Ah, Miss Marple, a pleasure as always," he greeted her. "What brings you in today? Looking for another of those lovely old china cups?" "Not today, Mr. Merton," she replied, her voice soft but with an edge of purpose. "I've heard you've recently acquired something rather unusual. A clock, I believe." At the mention of the clock, Mr. Merton's smile faded just slightly, replaced by a curious look in his eyes. He stepped from behind the counter and motioned for her to follow him toward the back of the shop. There, on a pedestal bathed in soft light, was the object in question. It was unlike any clock Miss Marple had ever seen before. The brass frame shimmered faintly, as if it had been polished just hours before. Its face was simple, yet somehow elegant. But what drew Miss Marple's attention most was the hands, frozen at precisely midnight. "It's an odd thing," Mr. Merton explained, his voice low, almost reverent. "Came from the old Carrington estate. They say it's been in the family for generations. The clock, it never strikes, you see. Never. It's always silent, as if it's waiting for something." Miss Marple stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning the clock. There was something about it that made her uneasy, though she could not put her finger on it. It was too still, too quiet. And then she noticed the inscription along the edge of the clock's face, almost too faint to read. "Only when silence is broken will the code be heard." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The code. The letter from the night before. This was the clock she had been searching for. The midnight clock indeed. "I'm assuming you've heard the rumours, Mr. Merton," Miss Marple said, her voice casual but edged with a knowing tone, "that the clock is cursed." The shopkeeper's face darkened, his hands tightening around the edge of the pedestal. "Not cursed, Miss Marple, but, well, strange things have happened around it. People disappear when they try to move it. Sometimes when the clock is left alone, the air in the room changes. Heavy, stifling." Miss Marple's mind raced. Silence broken, code to be heard, a strange aura. This was no ordinary clock, but what was its secret? She nodded slowly, taking note of the delicate craftsmanship. The clock's presence was commanding yet subtle, its beauty almost too perfect to be real. Her fingers brushed the cool brass, and for a moment she could almost feel the faintest vibration, like the hum of a string stretched too tightly, waiting to snap. "Mr. Merton," she said softly, her voice now steady. "I'll take it. I believe it may hold the answers I seek." The shopkeeper looked surprised, his eyes widening slightly, but nodded after a brief pause. "Very well, Miss Marple. But be careful. The Carringtons were never quite the same after the clock came into their lives." By the time Miss Marple returned home, the village was bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon. She entered her house, placing the midnight clock gently on her mantel, its presence now filling the room in an almost oppressive way. The clock stood silent, its hands unmoving. Miss Marple stood back, regarding it for a moment, as the soft ticking of her other clock filled the silence. Silence. Was it truly broken? The clock had not moved, and yet it felt like something was stirring just beneath the surface. Her fingers hovered near the clock's brass knob. She turned it gently, almost expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The silence of the room remained, thick and suffocating. Miss Marple's mind was sharp as ever, and she felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. The silence was key. She knew it, and she would break it. She sat down in her favorite armchair, hands folded in her lap, and stared at the clock. As the evening shadows grew longer and the light dimmed, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled with possibilities. The clock was more than just an object. It was a puzzle, a riddle she was determined to solve. In the stillness of her sitting room, the clock remained silent, its hands frozen in time. But Miss Marple knew something that the clock did not. She would uncover its secret, no matter how long it took. The silence of the midnight clock would not last forever.
Chapter 3. The First Clue. The days seemed to stretch endlessly in St. Mary Mead, where the rhythms of life continued uninterrupted by the events that were quietly unfolding in Miss Marple's cottage. The village, as always, was wrapped in a blanket of calm, with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the soft murmur of distant voices carrying through the streets. Yet, for Miss Marple, there was an undercurrent of urgency that tugged at her thoughts. It had been 2 nights since she had brought the midnight clock into her home, and though the clock sat silently on the mantelpiece, its stillness had begun to gnaw at her. The air in her sitting room, usually warm and inviting, felt colder each time she entered. The silence was oppressive, as if the clock itself was waiting for something. But what? Miss Marple sat in her armchair, her knitting abandoned on the side table. The clock before her was as unyielding as ever, its brass face gleaming in the flickering firelight, its hands frozen at midnight. She had tried everything, turning the brass knob, tapping the face lightly, even speaking to it softly, as if coaxing it to reveal its secrets. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts steady and deliberate. It wasn't like her to be frustrated. No, this was a puzzle she would solve, as she always did. The room felt unnaturally still as she stared at the clock. Her gaze moved from the hands, frozen in time, to the delicate engraving around the edges of the clock's face, nearly invisible unless one knew to look closely. Only when silence is broken will the code be heard. She read it again, the words dancing on her mind like a riddle. Silence is broken, but how? The sound of the clock was as dead as the night itself. No ticking, no chimes, nothing. Her fingers, slightly trembling but resolute, reached out to touch the clock again. This time, as her fingers grazed the cold brass, she felt something she hadn't noticed before. A faint click. A subtle movement, barely perceptible, but enough to make her pulse quicken. She pulled her hand back, her mind racing. What was that? A mechanism inside the clock. With her heart pounding slightly in her chest, Miss Marple leaned in closer. Her eyes scanned every inch of the clock's face, searching for a hidden mechanism or a clue that could explain the mysterious click. It was then that her gaze fell upon a small, almost imperceptible seam on the side of the clock, just below the brass knob she had turned so many times. Miss Marple's fingers moved with surprising speed as she pried open the small latch. Inside, hidden behind the clock's face, was a tiny compartment. She reached inside, her breath catching in her throat as her fingers brushed against something soft, a rolled piece of parchment. Carefully, she pulled it free and unrolled it, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting. The first step has been taken. The time is near. Follow the code and silence will
yields its secret. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine as she read the message. It was clear now. The clock wasn't just a timepiece. It was a key, a puzzle in itself, and it was guiding her towards something she couldn't yet understand. But the mention of a code, of time and silence, made her think of the riddle she had uncovered in the letter. The clock's silence was not simply an absence of sound. It was a challenge, an invitation to find the key. Miss Marple sat back, her mind working through the possibilities. There was something deliberate in the way the message had been hidden, but the question was, what did the clock want her to do? Her eyes moved to the mantelpiece where the clock still stood, its frozen hands mocking her attempts to solve it. She stared at it, as if daring it to reveal its next secret. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the room. Miss Marple felt the weight of the moment, the heavy quiet that had settled around her since the clock had arrived. Every tick of the clock in her other room seemed to echo louder now, as if urging her forward. Miss Marple's thoughts were like a well-oiled machine, each piece clicking into place as she followed the thread of logic. The silence. It had to be broken, somehow. But it wasn't just the clock's silence. It was something more. She glanced at the letter again. Follow the code and silence will yield its secret. Something needed to happen, something subtle but deliberate. The answer was hidden in plain sight. After a moment's pause, Miss Marple rose from her chair. The room seemed to grow colder, and the silence of the clock became almost unbearable. She crossed the room slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the mantel as she passed the clock. It was then that she noticed something she hadn't before. The faintest shadow moved across the wall. The shadows of the room dancing in the firelight seemed to flicker unnaturally. A strange sensation of déjà vu washed over Miss Marple. She had seen this before, not in the room, but in her mind. The pattern of the shadows, the way they shifted in the dim light. It reminded her of something, though she couldn't place it. Then, as if on cue, the faintest sound broke the silence. Just a whisper, a soft tick, like the sound of a clock beginning to move again, though no visible change occurred. Miss Marple froze. Her eyes darted to the clock on the mantelpiece. Had it moved? Was it ticking again? But the clock's hands remained frozen, motionless. Still, Miss Marple felt a shift in the air, a subtle change in the atmosphere around her. Something had shifted in the room. But what? Was it just the firelight playing tricks on her, or had the clock truly given her a clue? She walked back to her chair, her mind still reeling with the possibilities. The whisper, the tick. Was the clock trying to communicate something more than she understood? The silent code, the first clue. It was all connected, but the pieces were scattered. And with that, Miss Marple knew that the real puzzle had only just begun. The midnight clock was waiting for her to decipher its next step, and time, it seemed, was no longer on her side. Chapter 4. A Visit to the Manor.
The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village of St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple made her way down the familiar cobbled streets. The day had been warm, the air thick with the scent of blooming roses and fresh bread. Yet her thoughts were far from the peaceful surroundings. The midnight clock, with its stillness and mystery, seemed to cling to her thoughts like a thick fog. Though Miss Marple had spent hours trying to decipher the clock's secrets, something in her gut told her she needed more. The message she had found, the first clue, wasn't enough on its own. She needed to understand the clock's history, its origins, and the family who had kept it. There was more to this puzzle than just its silent ticking. The riddle seemed to have deeper roots, and Miss Marple was certain that the answer lay in the manor where the clock had once belonged. The Carrington Manor. Miss Marple had heard rumours of the house over the years, whispers of strange occurrences, of sudden disappearances, and of a family whose wealth had faded as quickly as their names had. The Carringtons had long since disappeared, but the manor still stood, isolated and distant, perched on the edge of the village like a forgotten relic of another time. As she walked toward the manor, her steps slow and deliberate, the village seemed to grow quieter, as though holding its breath. The path became narrower, flanked by thick hedgerows that nearly swallowed the path in shadows. The house appeared in the distance, its dark silhouette framed by the fading light of the day. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily in her chest, her sharp mind already piecing together the threads of the mystery. She knew this visit would yield something significant. She could feel it in the air. When Miss Marple arrived at the manor gates, they creaked open with an eerie sound that seemed to resonate in the stillness. She stepped inside, her shoes tapping softly against the gravel driveway as she walked toward the grand entrance. The house loomed before her, an imposing structure with tall windows that seemed to watch her every move. The door opened before she could knock, and standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, the housekeeper, Mrs. Dearborn. Her face was lined with age, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, but her eyes were sharp and alert, as if she had seen more than her fair share of strange occurrences. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Dearborn said, her voice a soft whisper. "I knew you'd come. I've been expecting you." Miss Marple gave a small smile, though the weight of the woman's words made her pause. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Dearborn. I simply had a few questions." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. "Questions? About the clock, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes steady. "Yes, about the midnight clock. I believe it once belonged to the Carrington family. Do you know anything about it?" The housekeeper's expression darkened, and she hesitated before stepping aside, gesturing for Miss Marple to enter. The inside of the manor was just as Miss Marple had expected, grand yet worn. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, and the floors creaked beneath her feet, as though the house itself were alive, groaning under the weight of its years. The smell of dust and old wood hung in the air, but there was something else too, a faint scent of something more ancient, something hidden. As Miss Marple walked through the narrow hallways, Mrs. Dearborn led her to a sitting room, its windows shuttered against the dying light. The air was cooler here, almost too cool, as though it had been sealed off from the outside world for too long. "I take it you're familiar with the history of the clock," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. Mrs. Dearborn sat down heavily in a worn armchair, her hands folding in her lap. "The Carringtons were a complicated family," she began. "They weren't always like this. The clock was a gift from a mysterious benefactor, a man they said they owed their fortune to. But after the clock arrived, things began to change.
What kind of changes? Miss Marple pressed, her curiosity growing. The housekeeper sighed, a weary sound that seemed to echo through the room. People started disappearing. First, it was small things, objects vanishing from the house, strange noises in the middle of the night. But then, more people were gone, servants, friends of the family, and when the clock struck midnight, the air in the house would change, heavy, thick, as if something was about to happen. Miss Marple's mind raced, her sharp eyes catching every word. The clock struck at midnight. Mrs. Dearborn nodded gravely, but only when it wanted to. It was as though it had a mind of its own, and when it struck, people, well, they'd go missing. The Carringtons themselves were never the same after that. They grew more secretive, more paranoid. Some say they were running from something or someone. And the clock? Miss Marple asked, her voice barely a whisper. Where is it now? Mrs. Dearborn's eyes flickered to the corner of the room where an old ornate cabinet stood. It's in there, she said. It's been locked away for years. I've never dared open it. Miss Marple stood and walked toward the cabinet, her heart quickening. She had to see it. The clock was the key to the mystery. She could feel it in her bones. Mrs. Dearborn unlocked the cabinet with a creaking sound, and Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the midnight clock. It sat on a velvet cushion, its brass face gleaming faintly in the dim light, its hands frozen at midnight. It was exactly as she remembered. As she reached out to touch it, she felt a sudden chill in the room, a coldness that seeped into her very bones. For a moment, the air felt thick, stifling, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple felt a strange sensation, as if time itself had paused. The clock, with its silent face, was more than just a timepiece. It was a harbinger of something far darker. She turned to Mrs. Dearborn, her voice firm. The clock must be returned to its rightful place. But there's more to this mystery than just the clock's silence. There is a code hidden within it, something that's tied to the Carringtons' past. And I intend to uncover it. As she looked back at the clock, a sense of urgency settled over her. The pieces were coming together, slowly, but surely. The midnight clock had a story to tell, and Miss Marple was determined to hear it. Chapter 5. The Silent Room. The wind had picked up by the time Miss Marple left Carrington Manor, the last rays of sunlight retreating behind the thick clouds, which had gathered ominously over the horizon. The journey back to her cottage felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of the mystery she was chasing had settled over her shoulders, pulling her deeper into the heart of the puzzle. As she walked, her mind replayed every word Mrs. Dearborn had spoken. The clock, the strange disappearances, the unexplained shifts in the air. There was something far more insidious at play here than just an antique timepiece. The mystery of the Carrington family and their dark history with the clock was undeniable, but something still nagged at Miss Marple, something she couldn't quite grasp. Arriving at her cottage, she paused before entering. The sun had set completely now, and the chill of the evening air wrapped itself around her like an unseen hand. Miss Marple paused, her senses heightened, as if something in the atmosphere had shifted. The silence of her home, normally soothing and comforting, felt suddenly oppressive. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as she listened to the soft ticking of the clock on her mantelpiece. The midnight clock, still perched silently on its stand, its hands frozen at midnight, seemed to mock her efforts. She had spent so much time with it, yet it gave her nothing more than a sense of deepening mystery. The fire in the hearth crackled softly,
casting flickering shadows across the room. The warm golden light was a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive silence that seemed to have filled every corner of the room. Miss Marple took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as she studied the midnight clock. Its stillness was unnerving, and yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from it. Something about this room, this clock, felt different now. There was a shift in the air, a subtle tension that hadn't been there before. Her gaze flicked around the room, her eyes landing on the door leading to the back of the house, a room she rarely entered. It was a small, seldom used study, but it had been locked away for years. In fact, Miss Marple had almost forgotten about it, until now. Something was drawing her to that room, like an invisible thread pulling her toward a hidden truth. She stood, feeling an urge she could not ignore, and walked toward the door. As her fingers brushed the old familiar key on the mantel, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The house, her safe haven, was no longer just her refuge. It had become a vessel for secrets, secrets that were now demanding to be uncovered. Miss Marple unlocked the door with a soft click, the old hinges groaning in protest as she stepped inside. The room was smaller than the others in the cottage, with only a single window, the darkening sky casting a muted light over the space. The shelves were lined with books, old ones, dusty and forgotten, but it wasn't the books that caught her attention. It was the strange, almost imperceptible chill in the air, the way the shadows in this room seemed to bend in unnatural directions. As Miss Marple stepped further into the room, her eyes caught a faint glimmer in the far corner. There, half hidden behind a bookcase, was a small, dusty desk. It seemed out of place in the otherwise cluttered room, its surface untouched by time. On it, a single object sat, a small, ornate box, intricately carved with patterns that seemed to swirl and shift as she stared at them. She approached it cautiously, her breath catching in her chest. The box wasn't large, but its presence felt significant, almost as though it were waiting for her to unlock its secrets. The carving on the box was familiar, she realized, matching the intricate patterns she had seen on the midnight clock's frame. Her fingers hovered over the lid of the box, a sense of anticipation building in her chest. There was something inside, something important. She could feel it. The box seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if it were alive, waiting for her to release what it held. With a steady hand, Miss Marple lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a small, fragile piece of parchment. She held it delicately, almost reverently, as she unfurled it. The writing on the paper was faint, but legible. The clock waits for no one. To break the silence, you must follow the path of the unseen. In the stillness, the key will be found. A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine as she read the words. The message was a direct challenge to everything she had believed so far. Break the silence? Follow the path of the unseen? And what was the key that was hidden in the stillness? Something deeper was hidden here, something that was not meant to be found. But why had this box been hidden away in this room, its contents protected by both time and secrecy? Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit room, her thoughts racing. She felt as though the room itself was watching her, waiting for her next move. The parchment felt like a bridge, connecting her to a larger puzzle that was far from finished. But now, the riddle had taken on a new dimension. This wasn't just about the midnight clock, it was about breaking something far more profound, something that had been locked away for years. She looked once more at the box, the delicate parchment in her hand, the silence, the key. It was all connected. But to what? With a final glance around the room, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The next step in the mystery was closer than ever. The path was being laid before her, but she would need to uncover the unseen, the pieces hidden in the shadows, to reveal the truth. And with that thought, Miss Marple felt the chill of the room shift slightly, as if the house too were beginning to wake. Chapter 6. The Hidden Melody. The night was deep and still as Miss Marple sat by the fire in her cottage, her knitting abandoned once more on the table beside her. The midnight clock, which she had now grown accustomed to, stood silently on the mantel, its hands frozen at midnight. But there was something different in the air tonight, a subtle tension that wrapped itself around her like a thick fog. She could feel it in her bones. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound that filled the room. For hours, Miss Marple had sat in quiet contemplation, her mind swirling with fragments of clues that seemed to tease her just out of reach. The note from the box, the mysterious message about the unseen path, and the strange vibrations she had felt when touching the clock, all of it seemed to be pointing her in a direction she couldn't fully grasp. Miss Marple thought back to the housekeeper's words. The Carringtons had kept their secrets well hidden, but now it seemed the clock was ready to share its own. She had to listen more closely. There was more to this silence, more to the stillness that enveloped her. But how? She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the midnight clock. The brass face gleamed faintly in the dim light, the time frozen, suspended in eternal midnight. The air felt thick around it, oppressive in a way that made her breath catch. Her fingers lightly brushed the surface of the clock, as they had countless times before, but this time, something was different. The slightest shift in the air, the faintest vibration, ran through her fingertips. Miss Marple's eyes widened. The clock. It was alive in a way. The silence had been waiting, and now it was starting to give her something. She leaned in closer, listening. For a moment, the room was completely still. The fire crackled, the wind outside whispered through the trees, but something else, something faint, began to emerge from the quiet. A soft, melodic chime, almost imperceptible at first, filled the air. Miss Marple held her breath. Was it the clock? Had it finally made a sound? The melody. It was so faint, so gentle, like the wind itself singing a quiet tune. The sound deepened, becoming clearer, like a distant lullaby. It was not a simple chime. It was a song, a hidden melody woven into the very fabric of the silence. Miss Marple sat motionless, her heart thudding in her chest. She knew instinctively that this was the key. This was what the clock had been waiting to reveal. But there was something strange about the melody. It wasn't just a sound. It was an experience, a feeling that tugged at her very soul, like a memory half remembered, or a dream on the verge of slipping away. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, trying to focus on it. The melody had a pattern, a rhythm. It was leading her somewhere, but where? What was the secret it was trying to uncover? She opened her eyes and stood, her steps measured and quiet as she moved toward the clock. The room was growing colder, the shadows deeper, but the melody seemed to keep her calm, guiding her like a gentle current. She reached out to the clock, her fingers trembling with a mix of anticipation and fear, and she turned the brass knob once more. This time, when the knob turned, there was no resistance. The clock clicked, almost imperceptibly, and the hands, the frozen hands, shifted. Just a small movement, but it was enough. A soft click echoed through the room and Miss Marple's heart raced. The melody seemed to pause for a split second before resuming, growing louder, more distinct. But there was something more now, something new. The melody was no longer just a song. It had become a series of notes, like a code, a key. Miss Marple leaned in closer, her breath steadying. The code. It was here. The clock was giving her the next piece, but she had to decipher it. The melody was no longer just sound. It was a puzzle in itself. The notes of the melody echoed in her mind, and she began to mentally map them. Each note, each shift in the rhythm was a clue. The clock had given her a puzzle, but the pieces were just fragments of something larger. The song was not just a tune, it was a cipher, waiting to be cracked. Her fingers moved over the brass frame, and she heard another click, this one more definite. The brass seemed to hum beneath her touch, alive with the energy of the melody. Miss Marple paused, letting the song fill her senses. It wasn't just a simple tune. It was a pattern, a rhythm that matched the faint ticking of the other clocks in her house. But this one was different. It was a coded message, hidden within the notes themselves. She could hear it now. Each note wasn't just a sound, it was a direction, a path. The song was guiding her to something hidden in plain sight. With a sudden flash of insight, Miss Marple realized what the clock had been telling her. The song, the melody, was a guide to the next step. The silence had been broken, not by force but by understanding. The clock had waited for her to listen, to truly hear the song beneath the silence. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The mystery was unfolding, piece by piece. The puzzle was far from complete, but the melody had shown her the way forward. She straightened and looked back at the clock, now ticking softly, its hands slowly but surely moving forward, inch by inch. The silence had been broken, and the clock had given her a new key. The next part of the puzzle was hers to solve. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with quiet determination. The melody had spoken, and she was listening. But the question now was, what would the next note reveal?
Chapter 7. The Key. The night had settled over St. Mary Mead, quiet and unassuming, but inside Miss Marple's cottage the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The midnight clock, which had once stood silent and dormant, now ticked steadily on the mantelpiece. Its hands, ever so slowly, inched forward, time resuming after a long, unnerving pause. The faint melody, a hidden song embedded within the clock's very essence, had revealed itself to Miss Marple, leading her one step closer to the mystery that enveloped her. Yet, though the clock had started to reveal its secrets, something still gnawed at her. The puzzle was far from complete. She had listened to the silent music, had felt the subtle shift in the air around her, but there was still something she couldn't grasp. A key, perhaps, that would unlock the rest of the riddle. Miss Marple had never been one to chase after mysteries without method, and though the clock's movements were now a clear sign of progress, she knew there was more to uncover. She rose from her armchair, her movements deliberate as she approached the mantelpiece where the midnight clock sat. Its hands were now almost at the hour of 1. The air around the clock seemed to hum with life, and Miss Marple could feel it. This was the moment where everything would change. But how? She reached out, her fingers brushing the clock's cold brass surface. For a moment, nothing happened. She had learned not to rush these things, for in her experience, answers never came when they were demanded. Instead, they arrived when least expected, when the mind was calm and receptive. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled like the patterns in the clock's intricate carvings. The melody, the tick of the clock, it was all connected, but the key was missing. What did the clock need from her?
What was it waiting for? Her gaze moved around the room, resting on the old, forgotten cabinet in the corner, an unassuming piece of furniture she'd had for years but never thought much of. It was tucked away behind the curtains, nearly invisible unless one knew to look for it. And Miss Marple had, of course, always known where it was. The cabinet had once belonged to her late aunt, a woman with a sharp mind and a love for puzzles. As Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the cabinet, a memory surfaced, one from her childhood, of an afternoon spent in this very room, listening to her aunt speak of mysteries and riddles. Suddenly, Miss Marple understood. The key had been there all along. The clock, the melody, the silent room. It was all leading her back to this unassuming piece of furniture. With a sense of purpose, she walked toward the cabinet, her steps slow, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The cabinet's lock was old, but Miss Marple had always been able to open it with ease. As the key turned in the lock with a soft click, she pulled open the cabinet door. The dim light from the fire flickered against the dark wood, revealing the contents within, a collection of books, papers, and a small wooden box sitting on the bottom shelf. The box was old, its surface worn with age, but there was something about it, something familiar. Miss Marple knelt down and carefully took the box into her hands. Her fingers traced the delicate carvings on its lid, and a strange sense of déjà vu washed over her. The patterns seemed to mirror the ones on the midnight clock, just as the melody had echoed the same rhythm. This box, too, was a part of the puzzle. She knew it instinctively. She opened it slowly, the hinges creaking as the lid lifted. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a small, ornate key. It shimmered in the firelight, a simple yet elegant object, and Miss Marple knew without a doubt that it was the key she had been searching for. It was no ordinary key. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. It had been hidden away for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Miss Marple held the key in her hand, her fingers curling around its delicate shape. This was it, the key to unlocking the next step. But where did it belong? Where would it fit? As she stood, the weight of the key in her hand felt both reassuring and ominous. The room seemed to grow colder as the clock ticked, its rhythmic sound growing louder, as if urging her on. The melody she had heard earlier seemed to grow more intense in her mind, guiding her, but now it was mixed with a sense of urgency. She turned to face the midnight clock again, her heart racing. The key, the box, the melody, it was all connected. The clock had been waiting for this moment, for her to uncover the key that would unlock its final secret. Miss Marple stepped closer to the clock, her hand reaching out once more. The key felt warm in her palm, almost alive with anticipation. Slowly, carefully, she inserted it into the small hidden compartment on the side of the clock. The key turned with a satisfying click, and Miss Marple held her breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. For a moment, there was nothing. The clock remained silent, its hands frozen at 1 minute past midnight. The room was still, the fire crackling softly as though nothing had changed. But then, something shifted. The clock's hands, previously motionless, jerked slightly. Miss Marple felt a rush of air, like the sound of wind whispering through a crack in the wall. The melody, that same haunting tune, began to fill the room again, but this time it was louder, clearer, as if the clock itself was singing. The notes, once distant and elusive, now rang with purpose, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of their meaning. The hands of the clock began to move, slow at first, but then more decisively. They moved toward the next hour, inch by inch, as if time itself was returning to the clock after a long pause. Miss Marple stood there, her eyes fixed on the clock, her heart thumping in her chest. The room seemed to hum with energy, and the silence she had once felt so deeply was now replaced by the sound of the clock's ticking, growing louder and louder with each passing second. And then, with a final, definitive click, the clock struck the hour. The hands stopped, but the melody didn't. It continued, echoing in the room, as though the clock had unlocked something far deeper than just the passing of time. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about the clock anymore. This was about the truth that had been hidden away for so long, locked behind silence, behind melody, behind the very walls of the Carrington Manor. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. The key had unlocked the next step in the puzzle. And now, the final pieces were starting to fall into place. The truth was waiting for her to uncover it. She stepped back, watching the hands of the clock settle, its melody still resonating in the air. The midnight clock had finally revealed its secret, and now, the next chapter of the mystery would unfold. Chapter 8. The Final Piece. The night was thick with a peculiar silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you, heavy and unrelenting, like the stillness before a storm. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, the faint glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. Her fingers gently tapped the edge of the small wooden table beside her, the rhythmic sound a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of the night. The midnight clock, now ticking steadily on the mantel, had revealed much, but not enough. The melody had continued to play in Miss Marple's mind, each note like a lingering whisper, promising answers but withholding them. She had unlocked its hidden compartment with the key, and in doing so, the clock had resumed its steady march through time. But now, the hands of the clock had stopped again, precisely at midnight. There's something more. The puzzle isn't finished yet. It's close, but it's still slipping away. Miss Marple felt it in her bones, the feeling that the last piece was within reach. She had worked through every clue, every subtle hint the clock had given her. She had listened to its silent melody, deciphered its code, and uncovered its secrets. But something still eluded her. There was one more step to take, one final piece of the mystery that would complete the puzzle. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft silver light over the garden. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their leaves rustling in harmony with the distant sounds of the village, unaware of the mystery unfolding inside Miss Marple's home. A soft tick broke the silence, sharper now, more pronounced. Miss Marple's eyes snapped back to the clock. Its hands had moved again, but this time they were no longer frozen at midnight. They were slowly but surely ticking forward, inching toward 1 o'clock. The melody, too, had changed. It was no longer the faint whisper of the earlier tune, but something more resolute, more commanding. The notes grew clearer, each one falling into place like a musical code that Miss Marple could now hear distinctly in her mind. Each note seemed to guide her, to tell her that she was closer to the end. Something is shifting. The melody, it's not just sound, it's a direction. The clock is giving me the last clue, the final piece. Miss Marple stood and crossed the room, her slippers making no sound on the wooden floor. The fire crackled softly behind her, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill in the air as she approached the clock. Her fingers hovered near the brass face once again. She had already turned the knob, but it was the hands, now moving steadily toward 1 o'clock, that called to her. A sudden realization washed over her. The clock's hands, ticking forward, were not just telling time. They were marking a moment, the exact moment she had been waiting for. The final piece of the puzzle was not hidden in the clock itself. It was in the moment of stillness, the moment when time itself could no longer be ignored. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath, and when she opened them again, everything fell into place. The melody, the clock, the silence. It had all been leading her here, to this precise moment when everything would converge. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The answer was no longer a mystery, but a certainty. The clock had guided her, and now she understood what it was trying to tell her. She leaned forward and turned the clock's knob once more. This time there was no resistance, no hesitation. The hands of the clock clicked as they moved forward, and with that simple motion, everything changed. The clock struck once, and then it struck again, and then nothing. The melody, which had been growing louder, softer, rising and falling in perfect harmony with the ticking of the clock, stopped abruptly. A deep, heavy silence filled the room. But it was different this time. It wasn't the oppressive silence that had followed the clock's previous stillness. No. This was a silence of revelation. Miss Marple stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. The room, though still, now felt alive with energy. It was as though the clock had released something long buried, something hidden in the heart of time itself. She turned to the mantel where the midnight clock stood. The hands had finally stopped moving, but the air in the room had changed. It was no longer just a clock. It was something more, a key to a deeper understanding. A soft click sounded in the distance, like the unlocking of a door. The clock had given her the final piece of the puzzle, and with it came the last revelation. Miss Marple smiled, a calm, satisfied smile. She had cracked the code. The midnight clock had kept its secrets for so long, but now they were hers. Every note, every moment, every turn of the key, it had all led to this. The melody, which had been the clock's final gift, had revealed its secret in the most subtle way. It had guided Miss Marple to the truth, no longer a riddle, no longer a mystery. The silence had been broken, and in that silence, the key had been found. With the final piece in place, Miss Marple stood in the quiet room, the soft ticking of the clock now a comforting, steady presence. The mystery had been solved, and the truth lay before her, clear and undeniable. Time had moved, the clock had spoken, and Miss Marple had listened. She turned away from the clock, her heart calm, her mind at peace. The mystery was complete. The final piece had fallen into place, and the secret of the midnight clock was now hers to keep. Chapter 9. The final revelation. The night had drawn in completely now, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting a cool, pale light through the window of Miss Marple's sitting room. The fire in the hearth had dimmed to a soft glow, and the room was filled with the comforting scent of burning wood. But despite the warmth of the fire, a strange chill lingered in the air, an electric tension that Miss Marple couldn't quite shake. The midnight clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, its hands now frozen at precisely 1 o'clock. The room had transformed in the last few days, becoming not just a place of quiet reflection, but a place of mystery, of discovery. Every object, every shadow seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final truth to be revealed. And yet, despite all the progress, despite the key and the melodies, there was still something she hadn't understood. The clock had been guiding her all this time, but what was the final answer? Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the clock again. She had been so focused on its movements, the ticking, the clicking, the hidden compartments, that she had overlooked the simplest of clues, the clock itself. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was a vessel, a keeper of something far older, something far more significant than just the passage of time. She stood up, her thoughts sharp and deliberate, and walked toward the mantel. The clock's presence seemed more commanding than ever now, its brass face gleaming softly in the dim light of the room. The melody from earlier still echoed in her mind, faint but persistent, like a song that lingered long after the music had stopped. Miss Marple had listened to it, deciphered it, but there was one thing she hadn't done yet. She hadn't truly understood it. The fire crackled softly behind her, and Miss Marple gently reached out to touch the clock's face. Her fingers brushed against the cool brass, and for a moment she felt that familiar, subtle vibration run through her. She could feel the life of the clock beneath her fingertips, as if it were breathing in tandem with her own. There was something about the clock's stillness now, so perfect, so complete. It wasn't simply ticking through time anymore. It had become a symbol of something beyond the physical, a connection to a truth that had been locked away for generations. Her hand lingered on the clock, and as she traced the patterns around its face, something shifted in the air. She felt it more than she heard it, the faintest whisper of movement, as if the room itself had exhaled. Suddenly, the room was filled with an overwhelming sense of stillness, a silence so deep it pressed against her ears. Miss Marple held her breath, her eyes closed for a brief moment, letting the quiet settle over her. She had been chasing after answers for so long. The melody had led her to the clock, and the clock had led her here, to this moment of perfect, eerie silence. And then it came to her. Miss Marple opened her eyes and stepped back. She had been looking at the clock all this time, focusing on its movement, its melody, the subtle clues hidden in its face. But now she realized something far simpler. The clock was not just a riddle. It was a reflection of time itself. The silence she had felt was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of the need for time. She smiled softly, a sense of understanding settling into her bones. She had been seeking answers for so long, trying to understand the clock's message. But the message had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The clock wasn't about breaking time or bending it. It was about understanding it, about recognizing that time, in all its quietude, had a way of telling stories. The story of the Carringtons, of the secrets they had kept, of the clock itself. It had all been part of the same thread, woven together across generations. She turned toward the window, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. In the distance, the village was peaceful, unaware of the mysteries she had unravelled in her little cottage. The quiet, still air seemed to match the peace in her heart. Miss Marple's eyes drifted back to the clock. Its hands, still frozen at 1 o'clock, were no longer just a symbol of time. They were a testament to the journey she had undertaken, a journey into the heart of the unknown, guided by the whispers of melody and the subtle click of gears. She had solved it. The puzzle was complete. The clock had no more secrets. It had told her everything it needed to, in its own time. And now Miss Marple understood. Time, in its quiet, unhurried way, always had a story to tell. And sometimes the greatest secrets were not hidden in the loudest moments, but in the spaces between them. With a final glance at the midnight clock, Miss Marple sat back in her armchair, her fingers gently tapping the edge of the table. The mystery was over, but the satisfaction of knowing that she had listened carefully, that she had allowed the story to unfold naturally, filled her with a calm sense of accomplishment. For Miss Marple, there was no greater pleasure than the quiet unravelling of a mystery, the gentle clicking of time revealing the truth in its own time, in its own way.
Chapter 10. The truth unfolds. The wind outside had died down, and with it, the last remnants of the storm that had been brewing all evening. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resting on her lap, but her mind was miles away, still wrapped in the web of secrets and revelations she had unravelled over the past few days. The midnight clock, now a mere presence on the mantelpiece, had given her all it had to offer. And yet, in the stillness of the room, a final sense of anticipation lingered, like a note left unsung. The clock, its hands still frozen at 1 o'clock, had ceased its melody. The soft ticking that had once filled the room now lay silent, but Miss Marple felt no discomfort, no unease. Instead, there was a deep satisfaction that washed over her, the feeling of a puzzle completed, its pieces all neatly arranged in place. Something else remains. Something final. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the window once more. The moon was a soft silver disk, hanging in the sky, its glow now gentle, no longer harsh or demanding. The room around her seemed more alive than ever before, the shadows dancing on the walls as if in silent acknowledgement of the journey she had undertaken. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the quiet of the room envelope her, before standing up with a sense of resolve. She was ready. The story, after all, wasn't just about the clock. It was about the journey, the connections made, and the understanding found in the most unexpected places. She walked across the room, her slippers barely making a sound on the wooden floor, and reached out to touch the brass face of the midnight clock one last time. Her fingers brushed over the cold surface, and for a moment she thought she could feel a faint pulse, like a heartbeat, coming from deep within the mechanism. She had felt it before, the subtle vibration of life hidden beneath the metal. Now it felt more like a quiet farewell than a final mystery. Miss Marple knew in that moment the clock had finished speaking. It had said everything it needed to say, and she had listened with patience, with understanding. And now it was time to release it from its long, silent vigil. She reached behind the clock, her fingers feeling for the small compartment she had once unlocked with the key. The brass knob felt cool under her touch, and as she turned it, the compartment opened with a soft click. Inside, there was nothing but a single sheet of parchment. This time, it was blank. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A final clue? Or had she been wrong all along? But as she picked up the paper, the room grew unnervingly still. The fire in the hearth seemed to crackle louder, almost as if the room itself were holding its breath. She stared at the parchment for a long moment, confused by the emptiness of it. What could this mean? Why was it blank? Her eyes narrowed, a spark of realization flickering in her mind. The parchment wasn't empty after all. It was simply waiting. Waiting for the right moment, for the right eyes to see it. Miss Marple exhaled slowly and moved closer to the fire, holding the paper up to the light. The thin, translucent sheet caught the glow of the flames, and slowly, very slowly, words began to appear on the page. Faint at first, as if reluctant to emerge, but then more solid, more defined, until they were perfectly legible. The truth is not found in time, but in the spaces between. It was never about the clock, but the people it touched. The silence you heard was their voices, silent now but never forgotten. Miss Marple's hand trembled slightly as she read the words, a soft gasp escaping her lips. The puzzle had never been about the clock's ticking, or the melody, or the hidden compartments. It had been about the connections, the human connections, that the clock had witnessed over the years. The people who had come and gone, who had crossed paths with the Carrington family, whose stories had been locked away in time. The truth, Miss Marple realized,
was that the clock had been the silent witness to a far greater history, a history of lives intertwined with secrets, of love and betrayal, and of a time long past but never truly gone. The midnight clock had been a symbol, not of the passage of time, but of the moments in between, those fleeting, quiet moments when history was made, when lives were changed, and when secrets were kept. The silence, Miss Marple understood now, was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of the voices that should have been heard, the stories that should have been told. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in her mind, and for the first time since this whole journey had begun, Miss Marple felt a deep, calming peace wash over her. The mystery was not just about uncovering hidden truths. It was about acknowledging the ones that had been left behind. She had solved it. The midnight clock had shown her the truth, not through time, but through silence. And in that silence, she had found her answer. She placed the parchment carefully on the table and looked back at the clock one final time. Its hands had stopped, and its melody had faded into memory. But Miss Marple knew that the clock, in its own quiet way, had told her everything she needed to know. The story was complete. With a final contented sigh, Miss Marple sat back in her armchair. The fire crackled softly, and the room, once thick with tension, was now filled with a soft, soothing peace. The mystery was solved. The truth had been revealed, not in the grandest of gestures, but in the smallest of moments, the moments that, when added together, told a story far greater than any single clue. The midnight clock had done its job. And now, Miss Marple could rest, knowing that all the pieces had fallen into place, and that the silence she had once feared was, in the end, the most profound truth of all.